The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Ramiz Alakbarov, Deputy Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, United Nations Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator. Ms. Joyce Msuya, Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator. Ms. Inga Ashing, Chief Executive Officer of Save the Children International, and Ms. Ilana Grisevsky. It is so decided. I propose that the Council invite the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine to the United Nations to participate in the meeting, in accordance with the Provisional Rules of Procedure and the previous practice in this regard. There being no objection, it is so decided.
Israel. De conformidad con el artículo 30.
In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Israel to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Ramiz Alakbarov.
Today, the world looks on in horror as the situation in the occupied Palestinian territories continues to deteriorate to a level not seen in recent history. Over 22 months into hostilities, Gaza is sinking deeper in disaster, marked by rapidly mounting civilian casualties, mass displacement, and now famine. The hostages held by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups continue to languish in appalling conditions. Meanwhile, the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, is also facing an unprecedented crisis. Relentless expansion of settlements, demolitions, intensifying violence continue to undermine any prospect of peace. The choice could not be clearer: continue the current path of perpetual conflict, entrenching the occupation, or recommit to a political process that will solve the conflict, end the occupation, and realize a two-state solution. Mr. President, tragically, there is no end in sight to the conflict in Gaza. Despite a renewed push by the mediators to reach a ceasefire and hostage release deal, a breakthrough remains elusive. Israeli strikes have intensified throughout Gaza, hitting IDP tents, schools, hospitals, and residential buildings. The human toll of these hostilities has been staggering. Since 23rd July, at least 2,553 Palestinians were killed, according to the Ministry of Health in Gaza. Some 271 were reportedly killed while attempting to collect aid, including in the vicinity of militarized distribution sites. Palestinian armed groups also continue to target the IDF and sporadically launch rockets towards Israel. Journalists continue to be targeted, with over 240 journalists killed in Gaza since the conflict began. On August 10, an Israeli airstrike hit a tent used by journalists in Gaza City, killing 6 journalists. The IDF said they were targeting Al Jazeera correspondent Anas al-Sharif, who they said was the head of a Hamas cell. On 25th August, Israeli strikes on Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis killed at least 20 Palestinian civilians, including medical personnel and journalists. I reiterate the Secretary General call for an independent and impartial investigation into these killings. The UN and its partners are working tirelessly to assist the population, but the security risks are extremely high and the current mitigation measures are woefully inefficient. On my recent visit to Gaza, I was stunned at the scale of the destruction and suffering. I met humanitarian workers risking their lives to deliver aid while themselves living in intolerable conditions. I saw the immense personal toll on the population, including the UN's own staff, but was also inspired by our staff's unshakable commitment to do their work. As they speak today, they remain present and continue to deliver essential life-saving services throughout Gaza, including in the Gaza city. Mr. President, according to the Israeli sources, 50 hostages, including one woman, are still being held captive by Hamas and other Palestinian groups in Gaza. 28 of them are believed to be deceased. While visiting affected communities in Israel, I saw the shattered homes of Niroz, where 1 in 4 residents was either murdered or abducted on 7 October. I met survivors who carry unbearable loss and trauma. I acknowledge today's presence of Ilana Grzyzewski, who will speak today about her experience as a survivor of Hamas captivity, and I pay tribute to her immense courage and fortitude. I have also met with the family members of other hostages held by Hamas, including Eviatar David, who briefed this council recently. In my meetings, I could see unimaginable pain in their eyes. I was also impressed by their remarkable strength. The videos released by Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad depicting emaciated Israeli hostages are deeply disturbing. The ill treatment and abuse of hostages constitute a blatant violation of international law. Hostages must be treated with dignity and allowed to receive visits and assistance from International Committee of the Red Cross. Mr. President, unthinkably, Gaza's population is now facing yet another deadly escalation. On 8 August, the Israeli government announced its decision to take over Gaza City. The resulting military operation is ongoing and, as we speak, for the population already struggling to survive, the Palestinians in Gaza are now seeing their worst fear becoming reality in front of their eyes. Already, 86% of the Gaza Strip lies within Israeli military zones. Expanded military operations in Gaza City will have catastrophic consequences, including displacement of hundreds of thousands. I am deeply alarmed by the findings of the latest IPC analysis, confirming that famine is engulfing the Gaza governorate. Ending famine is a race against time. It will require a dramatic increase in the quantity and quality of food entering Gaza. It will also require restoring the basic systems, such as water and sanitation, health services, food production, all what is needed to sustain human life. My colleague, Assistant Secretary General Msuya, will cover the IPC findings in more detail in her briefing. Mr. President, recent steps by Israel, including the 27 July announcement of a daily pause in operations in specific areas in western Gaza, and its approval on the 5th August of a mechanism for the controlled entry of commercial goods, have increased the supply of essential items to Gaza. Israeli authorities have also approved the entry of more diverse array of supplies, including animal feed materials starting this week. But let's be clear, these steps are nowhere near sufficient to address the vast scale of the needs. The lack of law and order also presents a significant obstacle to humanitarian operations. The unbearable conditions in Gaza have led to looting by desperate civilians, while looting by organized groups also continues to undermine relief efforts. it is imperative to restore the required condition for functional, community-based distribution systems to reach the most vulnerable. Israel's imposition of the new requirement on INGO registration is further constraining humanitarian response. With the deadline looming to meet the new requirements, many international non-government organizations operating in Gaza may be forced to cease their activities, leaving vulnerable communities without essential support. I urge the government to rescind the new registration requirement. All parties must allow rapid, safe, unimpeded, and large-scale delivery of humanitarian aid. Civilians, including humanitarian workers and those seeking aid, must be protected. Mr. President, for the sake of humanity, I urge all sides to put an end to this brutal war immediately. The only way to stop the immense and undescribable human suffering is through a full, immediate, and permanent ceasefire and the unconditional release of all hostages. Mr. President, the situation in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, continues to spiral dangerously downward. The territory envisaged for the future Palestinian state is shrinking, while a one-state reality of unlawful occupation and perpetual violence is rapidly advancing. During the reporting period, Israeli security forces continued operations in northern cities and refugee camps. More than 32,000 residents of three camps remain displaced as the result of these ongoing operations. They must be able to return to their homes and services, including those of UNRWA, which must be restored. In total, in the West Bank, 9 Palestinians, including 4 children, were killed by the Israeli security forces during the reporting period. Attacks by Israeli settlers have continued, often in the presence of Israeli forces, resulting in 3 Palestinians killed, damage to Palestinian property, and displacement of Palestinians' families. Attacks by Palestinians against Israelis also continued, with no fatalities reported in the last month. On 28 July, Palestinian activist Auda Hathalin was shot and killed by a settler in Masafer Yatta, and his 5-year-old son Vatan stood by, witnesses his father's death. When visiting the family, I held Vatan in my arms and thought about enormous tragedy of his future life without a father and with his community facing the constant threat of violence and displacement. No child should face such horror. Perpetrators of settler violence must be held to account. Palestinians must be able to live safely on their land. Mr. President, since 7 October 2023, settlers' attacks have escalated in frequency and become more violent and deadly. These attacks have increasingly led to forced displacement. Frequently, settlers then move into areas that were fully displaced and establish outposts with the acquiescence of Israeli authorities. This leads to further settlement expansion and consolidation of Israeli control. Corresponding government decisions are fast-tracking settlement expansion, including in the most highly strategic areas. On 20 August, the Israeli High Planning Committee approved a plan on the construction of more than 3,400 housing units in the area E1. If implemented, the move would effectively see a connection between the northern and southern West Bank. As such, it would undermine the possibility of a viable and contiguous Palestinian state. I urge Israel to immediately seize any steps towards construction in E1 area and recall that all establishment of settlements violates international law. Meanwhile, Israeli authorities continue to demolish Palestinian-owned structures, leading to displacement of 175 Palestinians, including 70 children. These moves align with broader efforts to entrench control over the West Bank, including last month's decision by Israeli Knesset to adopt a non-binding and symbolic motion calling for the application of Israeli sovereignty across all settlements in the occupied West Bank. Alongside these developments, the Palestinian Authority continues to face an unprecedented economic crisis. According to the Palestinian Authority, since May of this year, Israel has not transferred any clearance revenue collected on behalf of the Palestinian Authority. Overall, more than 2 billion US dollars of Palestinian clearance revenues is withheld by Israel. The correspondent banking relationship with Israel is under constant threat, and accumulation of excess shekel in Palestinian banks has escalated into a systemic crisis. All this presents a grave threat to the Palestinian economy and banking system. If left unattended, it could threaten the viability of the Palestinian Authority. Mr. President, the developments I have described are taking place in a volatile regional context with violence and tensions continuing to plague the Middle East. This week alone saw another exchange of fire between the Houthis in Yemen and Israel, continued Israeli strikes in Lebanon, and IDF incursions in Syria. I welcome ongoing diplomatic efforts to de-escalate tensions and urge implementation of all relevant UN resolutions and existing agreements. Mr. President, this alarming picture compels us to act with determination to reverse the present trajectory, starting with the ceasefire and the release of all hostages. What is needed now is a bold action to resolve the conflict, end the occupation, and re-establish a political horizon. In this regard, I welcome the convening of the high-level conference on the implementation of two-state solution, co-chaired by France and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The message from the international community is clear. The two-state solution remains the only viable path towards just and lasting resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We must work collectively now to advance practical steps, including through our engagement at the upcoming UN General Assembly High-Level Week in September. With Gaza immersed in a situation so horrendous that it defies basic humanity, and with the West Bank facing genuine threats to its long-term existence, we can no longer wait. I thank you for your attention, Mr. President.
Agradezco.
I thank Mr. Alakbarov for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Joyce Msuya.
Mr. President, members of the Council, as I brief today, I'm reminded of previous messages we have delivered to this Council over the past months, cautioning that famine, then a worst-case scenario, was becoming increasingly likely. On 22nd of August, the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification Famine Review Committee confirmed that famine is now occurring in Gaza Governorate and is projected to expand further to Deir al-Balah and Khan Yunis by the end of September. Allow me to share some numbers. Over 500,000 people currently face starvation, destitution, and death. By the end of September, that number could exceed 640,000. Approximately 1 million people are in emergency IPC phase 4, and over 390,000 are in crisis IPC phase 3. Virtually no one in Gaza is untouched by hunger. At least 132,000 children under the age of 5 are expected to suffer from acute malnutrition between now and mid-2026. The number of those at risk of death among them has now tripled to over 43,000. For pregnant and breastfeeding women, that number is predicted to surge from 17,000 to 55,000. My colleague from Save the Children will speak in greater depth on this. The suffering of children remains one of the most heartbreaking dimensions of this crisis. Mr. President, behind these stark numbers are human lives, daughters, sons, mothers, and fathers, futures cut short and communities scarred. The Famine Review Committee has been called 5 times to assess food security and nutrition in Gaza. We sounded the alarm after each of these assessments. We also reported to the Council twice under Resolution 2417 on conflict and hunger, first in February 2024 and again in June this year. Let us be clear, this famine is not a product of drought or some form of natural disaster. It is a created catastrophe, the result of a conflict that has caused massive civilian death, injury, destruction, and forced displacement. Last month, over 100 Palestinians on average were killed every day, according to the estimates by Gaza's Ministry of Health, nearly twice the average daily toll recorded in May. In the same period, some 800,000 people were newly displaced, pushed into overcrowded areas that lack shelter and other essentials. This famine is also the result of 22 months of restricted and compromised delivery of essential humanitarian and commercial supplies, degraded health and nutrition systems, lack of adequate shelter, and broken water sanitation and hygiene networks, which have accelerated the spread of disease and turned menstrual hygiene into a nightmare for women and girls. The famine in Gaza is also the result of a destroyed food production system where 98% of the cropland is damaged or otherwise inaccessible, and where livestock is decimated, as ASG Alakbarov has just shared. Mr. President, we have seen an uptick in aid entering Gaza over the past weeks, including in the number of trucks and fuel tankers. During this time, the UN and our partners have brought in at least 12,000 metric tons of wheat flour, supported 80 kitchens serving 400,000 meals daily, brought in therapeutic food for 30,000 malnourished children for 1 month, delivered truckloads of vital medical supplies, including blood units, and ensured clean water reached over 1,000 locations, alongside hygiene kit distribution and network repairs. Limited commercial traffic has also resumed in the past weeks. This has helped to bring down prices of key commodities, although they remain elevated and largely out of reach for much of the population. And after a long pause, supplies of animal fodder have resumed over the past several days. These are important developments, but they will neither reverse famine nor stop it in its tracks. To meet the needs of 2.1 million starving and hungry people, we need much, much more. We need to bring in and deliver greater volumes of life-saving assistance. We need the restrictions on essential items to be lifted. And we need a halt to the delays and denials that undermine our work every day. I would like to thank Mr. Alakbarov for his leadership as humanitarian coordinator on the ground, in particular for his ongoing engagements to address the serious constraints we are facing. Mr. President, international humanitarian law is a vital safeguard against hunger in conflict. It prohibits the use of starvation of civilians as a method of warfare and forbids attacks on objects essential to civilian survival, such as food, water, and agriculture infrastructure. It demands that the parties take constant care to spare civilians and civilian objects throughout their military operation. It demands that humanitarian personnel and assets be protected at all times and that the provision of unimpeded humanitarian relief be facilitated. There is still time to act. Mr. President, before I close, we must not forget the deterioration in the West Bank, where warlike military operations, settler violence, and discriminatory policies are deepening humanitarian needs and increasing civilian vulnerability. The recent approval of over 3,000 settler housing units under the E1 plan further threatens to fragment the West Bank and places 18 Bedouin communities representing over 3,500 people at risk of forced displacement, compromising their access to critical services. Mr. President and members of the Council, failure to act now will have irreversible consequences. This Council and all member states must immediately work to ensure an immediate, sustained cessation of hostilities in Gaza to prevent further loss of life and to stop famine from expanding. Second, the release of all hostages immediately and unconditionally. Third, the protection of civilians and critical infrastructure, including that which is essential for survival and the functioning of food, health and water, sanitation, and hygiene systems. Fourth, safe, rapid, unimpeded humanitarian access through all entry points and to all people in need across the Gaza Strip. This includes the delivery of immediate large-scale, multi-sectoral humanitarian assistance throughout the Strip, including items necessary for survival such as food and nutrition supplies, medicine, water and shelter, fuel and others. Fifth, the restoration of commercial flows of essential goods at scale, market systems, essential services, and local food production. Ending this human-made crisis demands that we act as if it were our mother, our father, our child, our family trying to survive in Gaza today. We must all do more and quickly. Thank you.
Agradezco.
I thank Ms. Nsuya for her briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Inga Ashing.
Mr. President, members of the Security Council, the Gaza famine is here. An engineered famine, a predicted famine, a man-made famine. As we speak, children in Gaza are systematically being starved to death. This is a deliberate policy. This is starvation as a method of war in its darkest terms. So the children's clinics in Gaza are overwhelmed by need, every bench packed with malnourished children and their mothers. Yet our clinics are almost silent now. Children do not have the strength to speak or even cry out in agony. They lie there, emaciated, quite literally wasting away. Their tiny bodies overcome by hunger and disease. The medical and specialized nutrition supplies they need all but used up. Without these, malnourished children will die. A few kilometers away stand ready a sea of supplies. Thousands upon thousands of truckloads of life-saving items, all blocked. The government of Israel could end this famine tonight if it choose to, and end its deliberate obstruction and let humanitarians do our work. Instead, there are reports of escalation in Israeli military activity in Gaza City, more attacks on hospitals, more killing. Mr. President, at our child-friendly spaces, children draw what we call wishing clouds so that they can imagine a better future. In Gaza, children used to wish for school or peace or to see their friends again. Once the total siege began in March, children would increasingly tell us that they wish for food, that they wish for bread. These past few weeks, more and more children have shared that they wish to be dead. One child wrote, I wish I was in heaven where my mother is. In heaven there is love, there is food and water. Children are being killed in Gaza by bombs, bullets, and now starvation. An entire generation at risk of being wiped out. Every decision maker in every capital in the world, everyone in this room, has a legal and moral responsibility to act to stop these atrocities. Famine means that there are no more breaking points and no more alarm bells. It is the worst case scenario. We told you this was coming, loudly and clearly. It has been constructed by design for 2 years. Famine is a technical term. It is determined by an independent, globally respected body known as the IPC. When there is not enough food, children become acutely malnourished and then they die, slowly and painfully. This, in simple terms, is what famine is. By measuring a child's weight related to their height and their upper arm to assess the amount of body fat and muscle they have left, we can objectively measure in real time the slow descent into the horror of starvation. The lives of at least 132,000 children under the age of 5 in Gaza are now at risk of acute malnutrition. This number has doubled since May 2025. Every other indicator confirms the IPC's assessment. In the first 2 weeks of August, well over half of pregnant women and new mothers screened at Save the Children's clinics were malnourished, 7 times higher than before the siege began in March. We have since run out of the supplement designed to prevent pregnant women and new mothers becoming malnourished. Mr. President, this is the predictable results of a policy of a sustained siege on food, medicine, and fuel. This month, over 100 aid organizations called for an end to the weaponization of aid in Gaza. These NGOs have worked in the occupied Palestinian territories for decades and are trusted and experienced. Israeli authorities have rejected requests from dozens of NGOs to bring in life-saving goods to Gaza and have tied continuous operations to new registration rules. These registration rules require impartial humanitarian actors to take actions that are unlawful, unsafe, and incompatible with humanitarian principles. The result is a further obstruction to unhindered, principled humanitarian access. Children in Gaza do not need so-called creative solutions, not airdrops that deliver almost no aid while occasionally hitting and killing civilians, nor creating inhumane militarized distribution systems where hundreds of civilians have been killed seeking food, forcing those who survive to choose between being maimed and humiliated collecting scraps of food or watching their loved ones waste away before their eyes. Families we support increasingly refer to these distribution points as the jaw of death. Instead, children in Gaza need member states to take action. The endless violence, cruel and illegal siege, block on the UN-led humanitarian system, mass killing of humanitarian workers, ban on UNRWA, and obstruction and threats of deregistration against NGOs are driving the humanitarian catastrophe, which in its turn is causing famine. Independent entities mandated to conclude and determine whether atrocity crimes and war crimes are taking place have done so. In addition, grave violations against children are being committed at an unprecedented rate across the occupied Palestinian territory, according to the Secretary General's annual report. The overwhelming majority were perpetrated against Palestinian children, though there are violations against Israeli children too, including children being taken hostage. Every child has the right to survival, to safety, and to a future. Any violation is a breach too far. Violence in the West Bank has been escalating at an alarming rate. Children face home demolitions, displacement, harassment, and intimidation by Israeli forces and settlers, including on the way to and during school. The mental health toll this has on their still forming minds is devastating. Save the Children is particularly alarmed by the detention of Palestinian children in the Israeli military detention system, which is a long-standing child rights crisis. No child should ever come in contact with a military court. Yet Palestinian children are the only ones in the world who are systematically prosecuted in military courts. These courts do not meet international juvenile justice standards. It is an abusive, inhumane system where children consistently report being physically, emotionally, and sexually abused, humiliated, and starved. Children held in this system must be released immediately to prevent further harm and protect them from practices that could amount to torture. The military detention of Palestinian children must end. There must be accountability for all crimes committed against children, against civilians, and hostages. Mr. President, children in Gaza urgently need the following: an immediate and definite ceasefire and the release of all children deprived of their liberty, including hostages and children held in military detention. The government of Israel must lift the siege and let the aid flow. The only way to achieve this is through unimpeded UN-led coordination. Member states must take action, support accountability mechanisms, end armed transfers, refuse to fund militarist aid schemes, do not risk complicity in atrocities. Members of the Security Council, I would like to conclude by explaining briefly what malnourishment and starvation means for a child. After one day without food, children begin to change. They suffer a loss of energy, concentration, and become upset. After several days without nourishment, their body starts to degrade. Their bodies begin consuming their own fat to survive. They lose their appetite and become unable to focus. After 2 weeks, the process accelerates and their small bodies rapidly deteriorate. Heart, liver, kidneys weaken, infections spread with ease as their immune system collapses. They become vulnerable to diarrhea, pneumonia, sepsis. At this stage, there is no fat left, so the body begins to literally consume itself, slowly, painfully eating the muscles and other vital organs. Belly swell and skin becomes fragile. At 3 weeks, the process of starvation has reached its final catastrophic phase. Children get lesions on their eyes and they go blind. Their hair fall out, organs shut down. Unable to move or speak or cry out, they draw their last breath. Those who do get urgent nutrition and medical support often grow up stunted. A stunted child will likely have impaired cognitive development, a weakened immune system, and increased risk of chronic diseases. Babies born to malnourished mothers are likely to be forever smaller themselves. Many effects of famine cannot be reversed. The death and loss, the physical and mental harm will last lifetime and even generations. In the words of a nutrition nurse who works in one of our silent clinics, she said, "Hunger is written on the bodies of our children, a constant reminder that survival itself has become uncertain in Gaza." For almost 2 years, the international community has failed to protect Palestinian children. Until you choose to act, this is the fate you are guaranteeing a generation of children in Gaza. Inaction is a choice. Indecision is complicity. Children have reached their breaking points. Where is yours? Thank you.
I thank Ms. Ashing for her briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Ilana Gritsevsky.
Mr. President, members of the Security Council, ambassadors, estoy hoy aquí.
I am here today, before you, not just to raise my voice, but also for those who are not able to be here today. Those who have still been kept hostage, or those who were brutally assassinated. My name is Ilana Gritsevsky. I was born in Mexico into a Jewish family, profoundly connected to Israel. My home was always full of traditions and customs linked to Israel. One of my memories of childhood is to understand the work undertaken by many international organizations such as the UN and UNICEF. When I was in school, we always proudly promoted the values that I had learned from the institutions. However, I'm now here and I'm wondering, where were these organizations when I needed them most?
I made Aliyah to Israel by myself. That decision was driven from my need to feel safe. Safe in a country which is free of danger from delinquents and cartels. A country where I can feel connected to my people, its culture, and have a future. Leaving everything behind wasn't easy, but I knew I was on the right path. Near us, a kibbutz near the border with Gaza, I built a home with my partner, Matan Sangauker. Our life was simple, ordinary, full of plans. I own a bakery, and later I was a manager of a greenhouse. Until October 7, shattered everything. At 6:30 in the morning, my life changed forever. That morning, Matan and I were sleeping at home, surrounded by everything we love. Within minutes, terror was upon us. We wake up to sirens, like every time before. Without imagining that this time, it was not just sirens. It was an attack by armed, funded, and violent terrorists who entered our home with intention to destroy everything dear to us. At first, we heard gunshots and shouting in Arabic, and immediately realized that hell was before us. We looked ourselves in the same room, Matan holding the door with all his might. Wael tried to calm our dog Nuni and keep him quiet, but we already know. They were going house to house in our kibbutz, near us, looking to kill, kidnap, and rape. It was our turn. They broke into my house, shooting in everything direction and breaking everything until Matan could no longer hold the door of the safe room. At that moment, we jumped out the window in an attempt to escape death. In that moment, I lost contact with Matan. I hid behind a cabinet on the back porch of my neighbors Gadi and Judith's house. Gadi Hagai and Judith Weinstein Hagai, like so many others in Iros, were murdered on October 7, and their bodies were taken into Gaza. Slowly, I hear the sound of dry lives breaking and the shout of terrorists approaching. And then they grabbed me by my hair, hit me on the stomach, causing me lose my breath. They dragged me across the floor, lift me, and throw me against the wall. They put me guns at me, tried to fill me with my phone. I raised my hands, told them I was Mexican, begging them not to hurt me, not to rape me, not to shoot me, just let me go. The only thing I could think was why my family have to see me end my life like this. The terrorists beat me, humiliated me, touched me all over, threw me on the motorcycle, and took me to Gaza. I saw Niros, the place where we built our life, turned to ash. On the way to Gaza, when they start to touch me and sexual abuse me, I passed out, physically and mentally. I couldn't hold it anymore. I guess my body prefers to shut down. They keep beat me because for them I was a prize. I wake up in a storm rain house, lying half naked on rocks, surrounded by Hamas terrorists. I had to beg not to be raped. I'm telling them I was on my period. At first, they didn't understand if I was on my period or I was pregnant, but nevertheless, that made them leave me alone. They threw me a hijab, a dress, at me, and ordered me to get dressed. I didn't know exactly what had been done to my body in those last minutes when I was in condition. But my soul already knew nothing will be ever the same. I was suffering for a fractured jaw, a broken pelvis, ear damage for explosion, and a burn leg. One of the first day, many people came to see me, to play main games. One of them fixated on me. He told me I will never leave, that I was beautiful, that we were going to marry and have children. Even if there is a deal, I will not be released. He handed me his gun, told me to play with it, and stole all my jewelry. The next day, around noon, they brought me another hostage from near us. That gave me strength. I realized I wasn't alone. We looked out for each other. After a week, our wars told us that the IDF is going to attack the house, so we need to move to a different place. I found myself walking through the Gaza streets, holding the terrorist's hand as if I were his wife. When we arrived at the other apartment, all of the neighbors came out to see the new prize. They knew exactly who we are. We stayed there for only one day and moved again. This time, they took us to a dirty house full with cockroaches. We slept on the floor with a thin mattress that wasn't a really mattress. We spent over 14 days there with barely any food, almost no water, constant psychological terror, no basic human or humanitarian needs, such as medicine, showers, hygienic products. In 55 days in captivity, I lost 12 kilograms, which is around 24 pounds. They did not give me any medicines. No doctor came to see me, even though I told them that I was suffering from colitis and anemia. The terrorists dedicate everything, where we call talk, where we call go to the bathroom, where we call get up. They wake up us in the middle of the night for cruel interrogations. From the moment I was captured, the wars were with me all the time. They did not wear Hamas uniforms. They dressed like civilians. They told me that one of them is a math teacher, and the other one is a lawyer. For 50 days, they made me sure I could not escape. They told us all the time that we would be hostage for 5 or even 10 years. When it was time to eat, they took a lot of food to their room that they have meat, rice, and vegetables. At the same time, they left us with our meal, which contained sometimes as little as 10 chickpeas or a piece of dry flat bread, which wasn't always well cooked. About 4 days before my release, someone knocked on the door. we wake up terrified, thinking we weren't going to be included in the deal. But they came to tell us we were going home. They changed our clothes, moved us, and prepared us to leave. But it was a lie. They transferred me to a hospital. Now I know it was the Nasser hospital. They look us through the back entrance and walk us past all the civilians. In the hospital, there was an area which was closed off and used only by Hamas. With an armored ward, they look us in a room where we meet the third hostage. The next morning, around 10 a.m., they told us again that we are going home. They moved us on another room and made me undress to check I have no surveillance device on me. Later, they briefed us, checked us, gave us supplies, and told us to get into a car waiting outside. But instead of taking us to freedom, they take us to a tunnel. There we see more hostages, some of whom were my friends from my kibbutz near us. I saw Eitan Oren and David Cuño there, who still remain in hands of Hamas. It was only then, in the tunnels, after more than 50 days, that I found out that my boyfriend Matan was also a hostage, just a short distance away, but I couldn't reach him. I begged to the terrorists to let me see him. They said later, and made me do different things, such as clean the kitchen to make me think that after that they will let me see him. Later, never came, and did not get to see Matan. The next day, they told me I was leaving. I refused. I wanted to see Matan. I knew that if I would leave, my soul will remain there in Gaza. But they didn't let me stay. So I left with a hole in my heart. I promised my friend I will do everything in my power to bring them home. And now I'm keeping that promise. People see my face and think I'm free. But freedom is not a switch you can turn on and off. Trauma doesn't vanish once you are released. Now, with every siren, every rocket for Iran, Yemen, or Gaza, I'm throwing back into the held. The difference, I have a safe room. Matan doesn't. He is still in Gaza. You hear about what Hamas has done on October 7. Women were raped, abused, and humiliated, and the world chose silence. Why is our pain treated as less? Why our histories questioned, denied, erased? I am here not just for myself, but for every woman and man who didn't make it home, for every voice which was ignored, for the 50 hostages still in Gaza, for their families. I'm calling on human rights groups and everyone who claims to care, stand with us, speak up, demand the truth, because silence is betrayal. Matan, stay strong. Don't lose hope. Your mom, sister, our dog Nuni, and I are all waiting for you. También estoy aquí.
I am also here. I am also here today as a Mexican woman, because that's where I was born, where the cartels kill and torture people. They call them as they are. Terrorists, criminals, delinquents. The world doesn't hesitate to condemn them. So that's why I wonder why Hamas, who burn children alive, rape women, and mutilate bodies, kidnap children and adults, why are they not condemned in the same way? Why is Hamas considered differently? Why is it not considered the terrorist group that it is? Why are Jewish victims questioned, and why are our accounts questioned when others are immediately believed? This is a double standard, and it's hypocritical. It's not just hypocrisy, it's betrayal.
Of the Council, do not turn away. Do not look for excuses. Do not allow political divisions to silence the voices of victims. Use your influence, your power, your responsibility to demand the unconditional release of every hostage. No tomorrow, not in some distant future, but now. We need to make a deal. People in Israel want this war to end. Bring them home. Bring Matan home. Bring all of them home. Only then I will be able to begin to heal. Only then can the hostages' families begin to heal. Only then we will begin to believe again in the values that the Council was created to uphold. Mr. President, Excellence, I was released after 55 days, but my soul remains in captivity with Matan and all the hostages. Until they return, no one of us truly free. Thank you so much.
Agradezco.
I thank Ms. Gritsevsky for her briefing. I will now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would also like to thank Deputy Special Coordinator Ramiz Allah-Kubarov, ASG Joyce Umsuya, and Ms. Inger Ashing of Save the Children International for their briefings. In particular, I would like to thank Ms. Ilana Gruchevsky for her courage and sobering testimony, and I do sincerely hope a swift and safe return of her partner, Matan. Mr. President, earlier this week, the entire world witnessed yet another killing of medical staff and journalists by attacks of the IDF, directly targeting a hospital. As Secretary General Guterres pointed out, I quote, "These latest horrific killings highlight the extreme risks that medical personnel and journalists face in Gaza," I unquote. We are gravely concerned with the repeated pattern of attacks and incessant killings of civilians, medical staff, and journalists. We note the IDF's confirmation of the strikes and its intentions to launch an immediate inquiry. However, a mere inquiry is not enough. Since the war broke out, we have witnessed a series of investigations resulting in no concrete measures. Thus, we call for transparent and independent investigation on all possible violations of international humanitarian law, as well as full accountability for all violators. Mr. President, far too many innocent people have been killed in this war, sparked by the terrorist attacks by Hamas on October 7th and Israel's massive military attacks. And another alarm was sounded by recent media reports that Israel's classified military database identified less than 20% of the fatalities in Gaza as members of Hamas and other militant groups. Yet even before these reports, we already knew through numerous statistics, daily reports, testimonies, and video clips, the scores of innocent civilians, including women and children, and aid seekers are being killed every single day. Thus, we reiterate our strong call for the protection of civilians by all parties in accordance with international humanitarian law. Humanitarian workers, medical staff, and journalists must be protected. And we call on Israel to allow international journalists to enter Gaza and report back with accuracy what is happening there. Mr. President, we are also deeply dismayed by the recent IPCC report confirming the famine already happening in Gaza. As USG Tom Fletcher mentioned, it is unconscionable that a man-made famine is happening now in the 21st century, despite so many warning signs. We call on Israel to immediately lift all restrictions against the entry and distribution of humanitarian aid. We are aware of elevated efforts to expand delivery of aid inside Gaza, including the airdrops. But as repeatedly pointed out by the UN, the ceasefire earlier this year proved that the dignified distribution of aid on the ground by the UN and its partners is the most efficient way. Having said that, we reaffirm our strong support for the humanitarian system and relevant agencies, including the OCHA and UNRWA. We all are aware of the best way to protect civilians and to flow Gaza with aid: an immediate ceasefire and release of hostages. Expanding military operations, including an attempt to take control of Gaza City, will only exacerbate the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Reiterating our steadfast demand for the release of all remaining hostages brutally held by Hamas, we urge parties to this conflict to faithfully engage in the negotiations to secure a ceasefire in Gaza. And we continue to believe in the tireless efforts by mediating countries including the US, Qatar, and Egypt. Mr. President, while our attention is mainly focused on the horrific tragedy in Gaza, we must not lose sight on the worsening situation in the West Bank. The decision by the Israeli government to resume the construction of the E1 settlements is of major concern. It will not only hamper the prospect of the two-state solution by effectively severing the contiguity of the West Bank, but will also deepen the instability and insecurity in Israel and Palestine, as well as in the wider region. Mr. President, Korea has consistently supported the two-state solution as the sole viable path forward. The advancement of this project will be an existential threat to this aspiration. We thus call on the Israeli government to reverse its decision. Any other unilateral actions that are in violation of Resolution 2334 including settler violence, demolition of homes, displacement of Palestinian civilians, and provocative actions must also stop. We hope that enhanced efforts by the international community to revive the prospect of the two-state solution will soon pave the way toward a secured future for the Middle East based on the harmony and coexistence. I thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Mr. President, at the outset, we thank ASG Msuya and Deputy Special Coordinator Al-Akbarov for their sobering briefings. We listened attentively to Ms. Ashing and Ms. Gryziewski, who brought to this Council the perspective of human suffering. For Algeria, this is not an abstract debate. Our compass points in one direction, and one direction only toward morality and legality, and also empathy toward all those who are suffering. We call, and we will continue to call for an immediate and conditional and permanent ceasefire, the only condition that can end the agony of Gaza. An agony born from the Israeli occupying powers' deliberate policy of killing, of destruction, and annihilation. Policy shielded by impunity and immunity. Let us be clear. Had Israel respected the ceasefire agreement brokered by Qatar, Egypt, and the United States, all hostage, all captive, all detainees would have reunited with their families, including your partner, Natan. Today, instead of embraces, there is only mourning and despair. Mr. President, the topic of today's debate is the Palestinian question. But today, I will not speak of the illegal settlement activities that fragment the West Bank into North and South and isolate Jerusalem from the West Bank. I will not speak of dispossession and annexation of Palestinian land. I will not speak of inflammatory rhetoric and actions that threaten the sanctity of Al-Aqsa Mosque. I will not speak of the continued erosion of the two-state solution. I will focus on the suffering in Gaza that has reached a level of barbarity that defies imagination. As the Secretary General reminded us, just when it seems there are no words left to describe the living hell in Gaza, a new one has been added. Famine. Yes, famine. A man-made famine. We have been warning of it. Now, famine is confirmed by the IPC. Famine is no more a fear, it is a reality. And it will expand by September if nothing is done by the international community, by this very Security Council. Famine cannot be hidden anymore behind manipulated figures and misleading claims of aid. Famine cannot be addressed through restricted access or token and impactless airdrops. Airdrops conducted only to soothe the conscience. Famine. Famine is the shame that will haunt all of us, all who could act and choose silence. But famine, Mr. President, is not only a word in a report. It has faces. It has names. It has stolen dreams. Famine affects human beings and their dignity. Famine consumes the innocence of childhood. Famine burdens the strength of fatherhood. Famine extinguishes the essence of motherhood. Famine drives humanity to its very limits. Pardon, President. Allow me to remind the Council. Yahya al-Najjar, 3-month-old, starved to death. His mother, words cut deeper than any statistic. I quote, "He survived his last 4 days only on water infused with an ice, because no milk, no baby formula was available." Yazan Abu Ful, 2-year-old, he is still alive. He stands
shirtless in the hand of his father.
Do you have children? Do you have grandchildren? Imagine being Yazan's parents, empty of despair, watching the candle of his life drop while powerless to help. Yazan Abu Fil, 2-year-old. Mr. President, this is the reality. This is the grim reality that the Israeli authorities want to conceal. This is why international journalists are banned from Gaza. This is why Palestinian journalists are deliberately targeted and assassinated. 245 of them have lost their lives. Late August, the IDF, Israeli Defense Forces, deliberately killed 6 journalists. They carried nothing but the word, but the image, and they raised nothing but their voices. The word, this very Security Council did nothing after this crime. And so, the Israeli occupying power repeated the same pattern. This Monday, the day before yesterday, at Nasser Hospital, 5 more journalists were killed, were assassinated. Among them was Maryam Abu Daqqa, a young, a beautiful mother. She was 33 years. Her armor was her press vest. Her weapon, a camera. A few days before, she wrote on X a letter to her 13-year-old. His name is Ghaid. In this letter, she left words that carry more weight than any official statement. And I quote, "Right, you are the heart and soul of your mother. When I die, I want you to pray for me, not to cry for me. I want you never to forget me. I did everything to keep you happy and safe. And when you grow, when you marry, and when you have a daughter, name her Miriam after me. Mr. President, will this council persist as a theater of lamentation, endlessly echoing speeches, while Gaza burns for lack of actions? This council must act as a matter of duty, a moral duty, a legal duty, must act to impose a ceasefire and protect and save innocent lives, must act to ensure unhindered humanitarian access at scale, must act to feed the starving and break famine. To fail is to be complicit. To delay is to accept shame. Yes, shame. To stop a genocide is not an option. It is an obligation. I thank you.
Agradezco.
I thank the representative of Algeria for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
President. At the outset, I thank Assistant Secretary General Masuya and Mr. Alak Barov for their briefings. I also thank Ms. Ashing for her perspective and Save the Children for the work they continue to do under extremely difficult circumstances, and commend Ms. Ilana Grutsuiski for her bravery today in sharing her horrific experience with us. No person should be made to endure such an ordeal, and we remain ready to work with fellow council members to bring an end to the suffering of all civilians who are experiencing suffering on account of the protracted Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Mr. President, the past few weeks have been marked by several extremely troubling developments in the occupied Palestinian territory, further compounding the plight of the Palestinian people and deepening the present conflict. Among those developments was the declaration of famine in the Gaza Governorate by the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, IPC, with Deir al-Balah and Khan Yunis governorates projected to experience famine in the coming weeks. The conditions imposed by Israel, including severe restrictions on the entry and distribution of humanitarian aid throughout Gaza at scale, and the void created by systematic dismantling of the humanitarian system in Gaza, have contributed in no small measure to this growing humanitarian catastrophe. In addition, the failure to find a resolution to the present impasse between the parties cannot be discounted. The aggregation of these factors has exacerbated the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza, causing a purely man-made famine to take hold. Children are suffering the most, their small bodies wasting away from lack of food and nutrition. Guyana calls on the United Nations, including the Security Council, to exercise its responsibility to protect innocent Palestinian civilians who are suffering the indignity of dying from starvation. Mr. President, another element of concern is the fate of professionals operating in Gaza, or the denial of their entry into Gaza to render life-saving support. Doctors and other medical personnel have been unable to access visas to enter Israel. Many medical personnel have also been killed and injured in attacks on hospitals. Journalists continue to be fatally attacked, including during Monday's horrific attack on the Nasser hospital. We condemn these actions in the strongest terms and underscore that humanitarian workers and journalists are protected under international humanitarian law. We therefore call on the Israeli government to ensure their safety, to investigate the circumstances surrounding the death of those killed during the hostilities in Gaza, and for all perpetrators to be brought to justice. Mr. President, the situation in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, also remains a point of grave concern for my delegation. Illegal settlements continue unabated, accompanied by violence, displacement, and dispossession. The recent decision to advance the El Settlement plan represents another grave threat to the two-state solution, specifically the contiguity of the Palestinian state. We are also concerned by the direct attacks on Palestinian livelihoods in the occupied West Bank. We have noted, for example, the 29 documented settler-related attacks between 12 and 18 August, at least 23 incidents involving damage to Palestinian-owned property. These attacks destroyed nearly 700 trees and vines, mostly olive and grape, which were uprooted, cut down, or burned alongside the torching of an animal barracks and the vandalism of a water network. What purpose do these actions serve but to further impoverish Palestinians? We call on Israel to abandon its colonial settler policies and practices, which are a source of great oppression to the Palestinian people. Mr. President, allow me to conclude by reiterating the following appeals. First, we reiterate our call for an immediate, permanent, and unconditional ceasefire in Gaza. Second, we call for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages still held by Hamas and other armed groups in Gaza. The taking of hostages is a war crime, and Guyana condemns such action in the strongest terms. Many families are rightfully distressed over the continued captivity of their loved ones, and the parties to conflict must prioritize the safety and well-being of these individuals. We are equally concerned about the ongoing and arbitrary detention of Palestinians in Israeli jails and call for their release. Third, we call on Israel to lift all restrictions on the entry and delivery of humanitarian assistance throughout Gaza to ease the massive suffering of the civilians. Finally, we call on fellow members of the Security Council to work together to bring a swift end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and to offer international protection to the Palestinians. A just and comprehensive solution to the conflict must involve Israel's full withdrawal from the OPT and the implementation of the two-state solution. It is our duty to ensure that this is done. Guyana remains prepared to contribute to these efforts. I thank you.
Agradezco a la delegación.
I thank the representative of Guyana for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Deputy Special Coordinator Alak Baraf, Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator Masuya, and Ms. Ashing for your briefings. And thank you, Ilana Grudzuski, for your testimony today and your courage. It reminds us how this war began and why it persists. It is also a reminder that this Council and the United Nations as a whole have failed in their mission. They would do well to listen to voices like yours and learn from what you have been going through. Colleagues, the path to a better future in the Middle East is clear. It starts with freeing Matan and all 50 hostages who remain in captivity nearly 2 years after October 7th, 2023. It means ensuring that Hamas, a barbaric terrorist organization, never controls Gaza again, nor poses a security threat to Israel. The United States continues to work tirelessly to accomplish all those objectives while supporting humanitarian assistance to innocent people in need. We cannot expect peace as long as Hamas is a ruling force in Gaza that is threatening or attacking Israel. It is no coincidence that talks with Hamas fell apart after several countries, including members of this council, announced their intention to effectively reward Hamas for the massacre by recognizing a Palestinian state, all while hostages are still being held in subhuman conditions. Hamas officials have even said that unilateral recognition is one of the fruits of October 7th. The United States continues to focus on the real and important tasks at hand, not conferences, but serious diplomatic efforts in providing humanitarian assistance in a war zone where a terrorist organization uses aid as the basis for its terrorist machine. Mr. President, we all recognize that hunger is a real issue in Gaza and that there are significant humanitarian needs which must be met. Addressing those needs is a priority for the United States. However, we can only solve problems with credibility and integrity. Unfortunately, the recent report from the IPC doesn't pass the test on either. One of the report's key authors has a lengthy record of bias against Israel, including openly justifying the Houthis' terrorist attacks on Israeli civilian targets. By his own measure, he ought to have recused himself. This helps explain why the normal standards were changed for this declaration, raising significant questions. We can spend no shortage of time pontificating and lecturing, but we are here to solve real problems affecting real people, and the only way to do that is with credibility and integrity. Colleagues, President Trump wants to alleviate the suffering the people in Gaza are experiencing at the hands of Hamas and has prioritized getting aid to people in need while implementing safeguards to prevent Hamas from looting. As of August 26th, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation has delivered more than 140 million meals directly to civilians in Gaza, 1.5 million meals just today. UN data on the UN's own deliveries tells a different story. Between May 19th and August 25th of this year, over 85% of trucks and 62,000 pallets of aid were intercepted in transit in Gaza. The hard truth is that the international community has poured hundreds of billions of dollars into Gaza over the years, while turning a blind eye to the fact that it was subsidizing and facilitating Hamas's creation of a terrorist stronghold. Colleagues, we will also take this occasion to reject the falsehood that there is a policy of starvation in Gaza. Since the beginning of the war in Gaza, Israel has enabled an unprecedented amount of more than 2 million tons of aid to flow into the Gaza Strip. We are working closely with the government of Israel to increase the flow of aid without benefiting Hamas and are seeing tangible results. Instead of echoing false narratives which only embolden Hamas, prolong the war, and hurt civilians in Gaza, we urge the UN and the rest of this Council to join us in working constructively to deliver aid to civilians that doesn't benefit Hamas. Rather than accept mass diversion of aid as a fait accompli, the United Nations, Council members, and IPC partners should support other mechanisms, including the GHF. We have also seen the Jordan Corridor and the facilitation of commercial deliveries of food and other supplies into Gaza, and airdrops by Jordan, the UAE, and other international partners. The United States stands prepared to contribute toward real efforts that will supply life-saving aid to people on the ground in Gaza. Mr. President, we share the same dedication to the hostages underground, starved in tunnels, suffering through Hamas's captivity. Hamas must immediately free all remaining 50 hostages, living and deceased. The reality is that this war could end today if Hamas freed all the hostages and surrendered. We urge the UN Security Council and all members to play a constructive role, call for the immediate release of remaining hostages, hold Hamas to account, and demand it disarm and leave Gaza. Mr. President, we understand that Israel has expressed deep regret for harm to civilians and has already released findings from its investigation into the strikes on Nasser Hospital. The IDF concluded 6 Hamas members, one of whom had participated in the October 7th attacks, were killed when the IDF struck the site Hamas was using to monitor troops at the hospital. We note the prompt nature of this investigation and response and call on this Council to condemn the continued use of civilian infrastructure by Hamas. We also acknowledge a stable West Bank keeps Israel secure and is in line with this administration's goal to achieve peace in the region. Finally, Mr. President, the United States welcomes the government of Lebanon's decision to task the Lebanese armed forces with a plan to bring all weapons under state control by the end of the year. This historic step shows the Trump administration continues to work toward peace and stability with our partners in the region. The Lebanese armed forces now must act to fully implement the government's decision. The United States will do its part to help forge a new reality in the Middle East alongside Israel and our partners. The Middle East can still be a region of opportunity, innovation, prosperity, and peace. We cannot miss this historic opportunity. Thank you.
Agradezco.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Deputy Special Coordinator Ramiz Alakbarov and Assistant Secretary General Joyce Musuya for their sobering briefings. I wish to thank Ms. Inga Ashin, Chief Executive Officer of Save the Children International, for shedding light on the deeply disturbing plight of the children in Gaza. To Ms. Ilana Gretzweski, I wish to express my deepest sympathy for the horrors you endure and commend your courage in sharing such a painful experience. Sierra Leone has consistently condemned the heinous attacks of October 7, 2023, as well as the taking of hostages by Hamas and other armed groups. We affirm our strongest condemnation of this act, which constitutes grave breaches of international law. Mr. President, for nearly 20 months of our 2-year tenure on this council, we never convened to address the Gaza conflict. We've asked ourselves how the situation could possibly become more brutal and inhumane. Each time we're confronted with new depths of suffering. from the decades-long occupation and blockade of Palestinian territory to the heinous Hamas October 7 attack of 2023, to the ongoing plight of hostages and detainees, reported incidents of sexual violence, and now famine. The picture is one of mass atrocity crimes unfolding in real time. Distressingly, even international judges and prosecutors seeking accountability have faced threats and sanctions. Taken together, these elements point to credible indication of genocidal acts and intent that cannot be ignored. On the dilemma of what more to say, we could today focus on recent atrocities, including the double strike on the Gaza Nasser Hospital. As a country that once benefited from regional and international solidarity through ECOWAS and the United Nations during our most difficult days, Sierra Leone feels a deep responsibility to speak plainly on behalf of the victims and to urge an end to the ongoing inhumanity and indignity. We therefore offer the following observations. First, amid this bleak picture, Sierra Leone wishes to commend the principal leadership of the United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, and the work of the UN leadership and teams in the field. Throughout this crisis, the Secretary General has spoken with clarity and courage, affirming that every war has rules and calling out violations of international humanitarian law. He has reminded the world that the horrors of Gaza did not happen in a vacuum, while condemning in equal measure the heinous terrorist attacks against Israeli civilians. For this, he has faced vilification, yet his voice has been a moral compass in a time of deep division. Sierra Leone stands firmly in support of the Secretary General's continued calls for restraint, for compliance with international humanitarian law, and for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. Second, what is unfolding in Gaza is not random. It is a systemic pattern of atrocity crimes. We note reports of indiscriminate and disproportionate bombardment in densely populated areas, the deliberate deprivation of food, water, medicine, and fuel, the razing of entire neighborhoods, attacks on hospitals, ambulances, and shelters, and the killing of journalists, medical workers, and aid staff. The Integrated Food Security Phase Classification Famine Review Committee has determined that famine is currently occurring in Gaza Governorate and that Deir al-Balah and Khan Yunis Governorate are identified as most vulnerable in the coming weeks. This Gaza famine is not a natural disaster. It is man-made, the result of deliberate obstruction and denial of humanitarian assistance, as we've heard from Ms. Ashin. Under international law, genocide includes killing members of a group and inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Today in Gaza, we see undeniable warning signs of exactly such destruction being inflicted on a civilian population. The International Criminal Court has already issued arrest warrants that include the war crime of starvation. The International Court of Justice has ordered the government of Israel to take all measures to prevent genocide, and to enable humanitarian relief. Yet, the devastation continues, and the orders of the ICJ are openly disregarded. The pattern, regrettably, is not confined to Gaza. In the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, we see a parallel strategy, a surge in settler violence, the expansion of illegal settlement, and plans that threaten to sever territorial contiguity. Entire communities are being uprooted, with the clear effect of rendering life unviable for Palestinians and making the two-state solution increasingly unviable. Scaling views this development with grave concerns. The parallels to ethnic cleansing are unmistakable. Third, we must also note the systematic assault on truth itself. As stated, the Secretary General has been subjected to campaigns of vilification simply for speaking the truth. The United Nations and its agencies have faced unsupported accusations. Even UN facilities, including schools and shelters, have been struck, undermining their essential humanitarian work. Journalists and media workers have paid with their lives in unprecedented numbers. News bureaus have been bombed, communications cut, and reporting stifled. Medical personnel, doctors, nurses, and paramedics have been attacked in clearly marked facilities and ambulances. Independent experts have described this as a war on healthcare. At the very least, these attacks amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. Silencing those who bear witness to suffering is an attack on truth and human dignity. Without truth, atrocity flourishes unchecked. We therefore call on all parties to respect the independence of the United Nations and ensure the safety of humanitarian actors, journalists, and medical workers. Mr. President, this council was created to respond to threats to international peace and security and to prevent the very horrors we are now witnessing. Yet, despite overwhelming evidence of atrocity crimes, our response has been disturbingly paralyzed. This echoes the darkest chapter of the 1990s, when the Council was rebuked for its failures during the genocides in Rwanda and Srebrenica. Then the world asked how the international community could stand by in silence. Today, the same question will be asked of us in our failure to act. The Genocide Convention obliged all states not only to punish, but also to prevent genocide. Inaction or paralysis in the face of clear warning signs is not neutrality. It is complicity. Inaction and indifference may equal complicity. Future generations will look back and ask whether this council did everything in its power to stop an atrocity in real time. History's judgment will be unforgiving if we fail to rise to this moment. The path forward is clear. We have listened carefully to the parties. From the state of Palestine, the calls are clear an immediate ceasefire, renewed commitment to the Arab Peace Initiative, disarmament of Hamas, and a reinvigorated pursuit of a two-state solution. From Israel, we hear the imperative of freeing hostages, the need for security, and the desire to live in peace and normalization with Middle Eastern states. These objectives are not mutually exclusive. They are interdependent. A cessation of hostility is indispensable to save Palestinian lives and uphold their rights, just as the release of hostages and security guarantees are indispensable for Israelis. There must be an immediate, comprehensive, and sustainable humanitarian ceasefire. There must be unfettered humanitarian access, with all crossings open for food, medicine, fuel, and water. There must be the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages and humane treatment of all detainees. There must be an end to the collective punishment and attacks on civilians, hospitals, journalists, and UN facilities. There must be accountability for atrocity crimes to the support for the International Criminal Court and UN's investigative mechanisms. These councils will also consider measures, including restrictions on armed transfers, to halt the means by which atrocity crimes are being committed. The core purpose of the United Nations is to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights. In Gaza today, we face a moral test that will define our legacy. Never again was a vow made after the genocides of the last century, but it becomes meaningless if we turn away now. Sierra Leone's position is clear. We cannot be silent, we will not be complicit, and we will continue to raise our voice for the victims. Major General Henry Kwame Ayodoro, who served as Deputy Force Commander of the UN peacekeeping mission in Rwanda in 1994, once recalled that when confronted with a difficult choice, he said, and I quote, "We had to act according to the dictates of our conscience," end of quote. This is such a moment. For the sake of international law, for the sake of humanity, for the sake of the children who are starving as we speak, the time for action is now. I thank you.
Agradezco.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I thank the briefers for their briefings. The Gaza conflict has persisted for nearly 700 days. Gaza has long become a living hell, with the 2 million Gazan people deeply trapped in a massive man-made catastrophe, and over 1 million facing a food security emergency. The international community needs to exhaust every effort possible to prevent further deteriorations. China reiterates that violence cannot bring security, neither can force win peace. Israel's continued escalated military offensives have resulted in the loss of numerous innocent lives daily. Israel's strike on the Al-Nasser hospital on 25th of August killed over 20 civilians, journalists, and medical workers, creating yet another horrendous tragedy. Israel is still moving forward with its military plan to take over Gaza. The plan, once implemented, will inevitably lead to more bloodshed and displacement, adding to the danger and insecurity both Gazans and detained hostages are facing. China objects to and condemns all actions that harm civilians, damage infrastructure, and violate international law. We urge Israel to heed the strong calls from the international community, immediately cease its military operations in Gaza, and immediately halt any dangerous moves that escalate tensions. China further reiterates that violations of international humanitarian law are unacceptable, the weaponization of humanitarian supplies is unacceptable, and the militarization of an aid distribution mechanism is equally unacceptable. All along, the biggest challenge for scaling up humanitarian assistance in Gaza has not been the shortage of supplies or the inadequacies of the UN and other humanitarian agencies. Rather, it has always been the occupying power, Israel's lack of political will, and its deliberately created obstacles. We call on Israel to fulfill its obligations as an occupying power under the international humanitarian law by opening all border crossings, fully restoring humanitarian access, and supporting the UN's delivery of aid consistent with humanitarian principles to truly alleviate the humanitarian disaster on the ground. China reaffirms that the long unfulfilled aspiration for an independent Palestinian state is a fundamental reason preventing the solution to the Palestinian question and the root cause of the recurrent volatility of the Palestinian-Israeli situation. The Palestinian people's right to statehood, right to survival, and right to return must no longer be ignored. Israel's recent approval of a settlement expansion plan in the E1 area of the West Bank will severely undermine the contiguity of the Palestinian territory to the detriment of the foundation of a Palestinian statehood. The international community must build on the positive momentum of the two-state solution, reinvigorate the political prospect of the two-state solution with the utmost urgency, firmly reject any forced displacement of the Palestinian people, and oppose any dangerous attempts to annex the West Bank and Gaza. President, when peace is absent in the Middle East, peace is elusive for the world. At present, the Middle East situation is complex and fragile, with multiple intertwined hotspot issues. Amidst all this, however, the question of Palestine remains central to the Middle East issue. China supports the Council in taking all necessary actions to achieve a ceasefire, ending the fighting in Gaza, and alleviate the humanitarian disaster. We call on all countries, particularly the country with significant influence over the parties concerned, to uphold a just and responsible position and play a constructive part. China will continue to work with the international community towards ending the war in Gaza, advancing the implementation of the two-state solution, and ultimately achieving a comprehensive, just, and lasting solution of the Palestinian question so that both the Palestinian and Israeli peoples can live in shared tranquility and happiness. I thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for the statement, and I give the floor to the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President. We are grateful to today's briefers for their information about the situation in the Gaza Strip. Over the past few days, we, just like many of our colleagues, were stunned by the new data on the record scale of famine in Gaza. These signals and persistent calls to Israel to immediately stop the collective punishment of the Palestinians have been forthcoming from different global capitals, including Moscow, and also international headquarters structures, regional organizations, and representatives of our global organizations throughout the world. Furthermore, the world is calling on West Jerusalem to recognize that there is no alternative to a peaceful settlement of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which would pave the way for establishing genuine peace and security in the Middle East. This is the sole scenario that meets the interests both of the Israelis and all of their neighbors. Today, almost 2 years after the start of the bloody war in Gaza, indeed, it's difficult to find the right words to describe the scale of the destruction and human suffering in the Gaza Strip. The most succinct and at the same time terrifying recent depiction was by the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who described the situation in Gaza with one word: hell. The UNRWA Commissioner General, Mr. Lazzarini, characterized the situation in the Strip as bordering on genocide, and the forced population displacement is akin to ethnic cleansing. Such statements in other cases in the assessment of the UN leadership is backed up by daily reports from Gaza about the deaths of dozens of civilians. Just the day before yesterday, indiscriminate strikes by Israel on Gaza killed 70 people. 2 days ago, live on air, as a result of the attacks on the Strip, the Nasser hospital was destroyed and more than 20 people were killed, including 5 journalists. Furthermore, judging by the images in the media, a cynical double-tap strike was used when rescue workers arrived. Even Benjamin Netanyahu already admitted that Israel's direct responsibility for what occurred, calling it a tragic mishap and promising to conduct an investigation. Mr. President, we'd like also to draw your attention to the actions of the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. Since the foundation started its work in May this year, the situation has turned into a completely tragic and unacceptable one. According to various assessments, more than 1,800 Palestinians have died trying to get humanitarian assistance. Thousands of them were near the distribution points that were managed by this pseudo-humanitarian structure. According to reports, strikes on civilians are occurring not only irregularly, but also precisely. People in their utter despair spend the night at distribution points and in response get bullets in them. This is no humanitarian mission. This is violence hidden behind good intentions. Under the guise of so-called humanitarian work, there is a policy of fear and intimidation against defenseless civilians. These methods are unacceptable. There's no doubt whatsoever that the work of the Foundation in its current form is dangerous and is not in line with recognized humanitarian principles, and denying this is pointless. Mr. President, given this, we're seriously concerned about reports in the media that the UN Secretariat, allegedly ceding to pressure from Israel and the US, has committed to ratcheting down the rhetoric regarding the GHF. We would like to note that starting from August, whatever the situation in the humanitarian reports in the UN have de facto stopped mentioning the work of this structure. We believe that we hope that these assurances do not reflect reality. We are convinced that the UN Secretariat cannot and should not renounce its principles, namely that humanitarian assistance should not be turned into an instrument of blackmail. We trust that the Secretary General and the humanitarian wing of the UN will consistently and unambiguously advocate for humanitarian assistance to be provided in strict compliance with the norms of international humanitarian law and the principles of humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence. Mr. President, the horrific statistics of the number of victims caused by the Israeli military operation in Gaza, more than 63,000 Palestinians have died, is in no way stopping the Netanyahu government that has opted to cleanse the densely populated Gaza city and to take total control over the Gaza Strip. West Jerusalem is not sobered either by the opinion of the overwhelming majority of the international community. We'd like to remind you that on the 10th of August, during the emergency meeting of the Security Council, almost all delegations, including those from Arab and Muslim countries, condemned the new escalatory actions of Israel, underscoring the growing security risks not only to the inhabitants of Gaza, but also to the Israeli hostages held there. We are also surprised that the IDF operation to take Gaza City was started against a background of reports that Hamas had agreed to the proposal of the mediators to release some hostages and to a temporary ceasefire. We are closely following the diplomatic efforts of the mediators, inter alia the efforts of Washington. Quite frankly, we do see some discrepancies in the views on how the negotiations are going. American colleagues are always saying that Hamas is refusing to do a deal. The US delegation has been trying to convince the Security Council at least of this over the past few months. At the same time, there are signs that the movement is prepared to do a deal, and Israel is either rejecting the mediator's proposal or is simply expanding the hostilities on the ground and is not demonstrating real interest in reaching agreement. This was publicly announced yesterday in the Qatari media, which, along with the US and Egypt, is participating in the negotiations. We have heard, colleagues, about the American aggressive diplomacy on the ground for some months now, but once again, we regrettably are convinced that it is not giving encouraging results. We would urge our American colleagues to think not only about the interests of Israel that they have been banging on about with great zeal, but also the fate of Palestinian civilians whose lives and futures today, to a large extent, depend on the action or the inaction of this council. Sir, multilateral diplomacy alone, which we are strongly urging our US colleagues to engage in, can and should give a chance to revive the two-state formula. This principle, enshrined in the relevant resolutions of the Security Council and the General Assembly of the UN, today truly is under threat. The reason for this, and in the case of the man-made humanitarian disaster in Gaza that runs counter to international law, is Israel's policy to establish new facts on the ground. The most high profile was the recent decision by the Higher Planning Committee to approve settlement construction in Area E1 in the West Bank to the east of Jerusalem. We all understand that the implementation of this large-scale expansionist project will breach the contiguity of the territorial integrity of a future Palestinian state, dividing up the West Bank into two isolated enclaves, separate from each other. What is frightening in this regard is not only the concept itself and the unambiguous utterances of Israeli officials. For example, the Minister of Finance, Mr. Smotrich, clearly stated that the plan would permanently bury the idea of a Palestinian state. That's the end of quote. But also that such provocative acts are enjoying support from some American senior diplomats. The US ambassador to Israel, Mr. Mike Huckabee, pointed out that the E1 area construction apparently did not violate international law. Such opinions directly run counter to the foundational document of Middle East settlement process and also the recent decisions of the Security Council, including Resolution 2334. Mr. President, in conclusion, we'd like to underscore our unwavering stance in favour of having diplomatic settlement alone to the Palestinian question based on the two-state, two-people solution to meet the legitimate concerns of Israel in the area of security and also the rightful expectations of the Palestinian people to their own state. The alternative to this is further isolation of Western Jerusalem and the international scene and the growth and the number of civilian in Gaza victims. Israel is thus not going to solve the problem of its own security, but it would just be simply pushing it off by fostering revenge and hatred among young Palestinians. This is extremely short-sighted and an irresponsible policy. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank Deputy Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, UN Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator, Mr. Ramiz Al-Akbarov, and Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator, Ms. Joyce Masuya, for their comprehensive briefings. We are also grateful to Ms. Inger Esching, CEO of the Save the Children International, for her sobering briefing. Indeed, it was moving. The predicament of the Palestinian children under occupation. But the question is, will it move this House? Indecision is complicity, as she rightly reminded us. We also listened with deep empathy to Ms. Ilana Grzyski. We sincerely hope for the safe and swift reunification of her family and all of those still in captivity. And we wish the same for those thousands of Palestinians
illegally detained and mistreated by the Israeli occupation for prolonged periods. Healing there must be for everyone. Healing that corresponds to the human suffering of all. Healing that would eventually close and cure the wounds inflicted by decades of occupation. Healing for which there can be no better dressing than justice and international law. Healing that can start now with a ceasefire. Yet we are in an endless war imposed by the occupier. Mr. President, it has now been 691 days of unrelenting tragedy in Gaza. During this period, Israel has trampled every principle of international law and international humanitarian law with utter impunity. More than 62,000 Palestinians have been killed, among them over 19,000 children, 10,000 women, and at least over 270 journalists and over 360 UN aid workers. Civilian life has been deliberately and systematically dismantled. Even Israel's own military data, as reported in the international media, admits that 83% of those killed are civilians. How can this ever be justified or defended? This cannot be collateral damage. It is mass carnage. Today, no place in Gaza is safe. Yet the indiscriminate military onslaught continues because Israel is confronted with no real consequences for its actions. Hospitals, schools, homes, nothing has been spared. The world is now witnessing live-streamed killing of journalists and rescue workers. The strikes on the Nasser medical complex were appalling and condemnable, yes, but yet they are tragically familiar, part of a grim pattern. There are those who shield Israel and try to silence this council into inaction. What else is complicity? In fact, impunity has become Israel's shield and this council's silence its enabler. The occupying powers' apologists must introspect and objectively assess the consequences of their policies. Mr. President, as if bombs were not enough, hunger is now a weapon of mass destruction. The latest IPC analysis confirms famine is now present in Gaza City, threatening over 500,000 people. The use of starvation of civilians as method of warfare may constitute a war crime. Undersecretary General Tom Fletcher rightly observed. And those are strong words. They need to be repeated in this council. And I quote, "It is a famine we could have prevented if we had been allowed. Yet, food stacks up at borders because of systematic obstruction by Israel. It is a famine in 2025, a 21st century famine." Mr. President, it is not by negating or criticizing and pressurizing the United Nations and its senior officials, or by denying and rejecting the findings of the ICJ and of global human rights and humanitarian organizations, or by silencing the media, that we can move forward. It is only by accepting the reality that we can build peace. Pakistan condemns Israel's so-called military operation and planned full occupation of Gaza City, which is nothing but a blueprint for further humanitarian catastrophe, threatening to displace once more up to 1 million people. Simultaneously, annexation in the West Bank and East Jerusalem continues unabated. The E1 settlement plan is a deliberate attempt to bury the two-state solution. We strongly condemn this action, which constitutes a clear violation of international law, including Security Council resolutions. The combined effect of mass killing, displacement, famine, settlements, and destruction of habitable land leaves no ambiguity. This is a campaign of ethnic cleansing in plain sight. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation, at its 21st extraordinary session of the Council of Foreign Ministers on 25th August, adopted a resolution that speaks with moral clarity. It has urged this Council to act promptly under Chapter 7 to stop the brutal aggression by the Israeli occupation and its violations, which threaten the prospects for achieving a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace in the region and hinder the implementation of the two-state solution. It has also urged the Council to hold Israel, the occupying power, accountable for all crimes and violations that clearly breach international law and international humanitarian law. The Security Council cannot remain a bystander. It must act now, with resolve, to fulfill its charter responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. It must demand, first, an immediate, permanent, and unconditional ceasefire across Gaza and the occupied Palestinian territory, with full implementation of Security Council Resolution 2735. We appreciate and support the efforts led by the United States, Egypt, and Qatar, and hope these will result in an early ceasefire. Second, an immediate and unconditional lifting of all restrictions on the entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza and its safe and unhindered distribution to the population in need of such assistance, as well as the restoration of all essential services. Third, release of all hostages and exchange of Palestinian prisoners. Fourth, a halt to Israel's declared intent to occupy Gaza City. And fifth, an end to forced displacement, illegal settlement expansion, and annexations in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Mr. President, lasting peace requires a credible political horizon, one grounded in international law, leading to the realization of a sovereign, viable, and contiguous Palestinian state based on the pre-1967 border.
Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Ramiz Alakbarov, Deputy Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, United Nations Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator. Ms. Joyce Msuya, Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator. Ms. Inga Ashing, Chief Executive Officer of Save the Children International, and Ms. Ilana Grisevsky. It is so decided. I propose that the Council invite the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine to the United Nations to participate in the meeting, in accordance with the Provisional Rules of Procedure and the previous practice in this regard. There being no objection, it is so decided.
Israel. De conformidad con el artículo 30.
In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Israel to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Ramiz Alakbarov.
Today, the world looks on in horror as the situation in the occupied Palestinian territories continues to deteriorate to the level not seen in recent history. Over 22 months into hostilities, Gaza is sinking deeper in disaster, marked by rapidly mounting civilian casualties, mass displacement, and now famine. The hostages held by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups continue to languish in appalling conditions. Meanwhile, the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, is also facing an unprecedented crisis. Relentless expansion of settlements, demolitions, intensifying violence continue to undermine any prospect of peace. The choice could not be clearer: continue the current path of perpetual conflict, entrenching the occupation, or recommit to a political process that will solve the conflict, end the occupation, and realize a two-state solution. Mr. President, tragically, there is no end in sight to the conflict in Gaza. Despite a renewed push by the mediators to reach a ceasefire and hostage release deal, a breakthrough remains elusive. Israeli strikes have intensified throughout Gaza, hitting IDP tents, schools, hospitals, and residential buildings. The human toll of these hostilities has been staggering. Since 23rd July, at least 2,553 Palestinians were killed, according to the Ministry of Health in Gaza. Some 271 were reportedly killed while attempting to collect aid, including in the vicinity of militarized distribution sites. Palestinian armed groups also continue to target the IDF and sporadically launch rockets towards Israel. Journalists continue to be targeted, with over 240 journalists killed in Gaza since the conflict began. On August 10, an Israeli airstrike hit a tent used by journalists in Gaza City, killing 6 journalists. The IDF said they were targeting Al Jazeera correspondent Anas al-Sharif, who they said was the head of a Hamas cell. On 25th August, Israeli strikes on Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis killed at least 20 Palestinian civilians, including medical personnel and journalists. I reiterate the Secretary General call for an independent and impartial investigation into these killings. The UN and its partners are working tirelessly to assist the population, but the security risks are extremely high and the current mitigation measures are woefully inefficient. On my recent visit to Gaza, I was stunned at the scale of the destruction and suffering. I met humanitarian workers risking their lives to deliver aid while themselves living in intolerable conditions. I saw the immense personal toll on the population, including the UN's own staff, but was also inspired by our staff's unshakable commitment to do their work. As they speak today, they remain present and continue to deliver essential life-saving services throughout Gaza, including in the Gaza City. Mr. President, according to the Israeli sources, 50 hostages, including 1 woman, are still being held captive by Hamas and other Palestinian groups in Gaza. 28 of them are believed to be deceased. While visiting affected communities in Israel, I saw the shattered homes of Niroz, where 1 in 4 residents was either murdered or abducted on 7 October. I met survivors who carry unbearable loss and trauma. I acknowledge today's presence of Ilana Grzyzewski, who will speak today about her experience as a survivor of Hamas captivity, and I pay tribute to her immense courage and fortitude. I have also met with the family members of other hostages held by Hamas, including Eviatar David, who briefed this council recently. In my meetings, I could see unimaginable pain in their eyes. I was also impressed by their remarkable strength. The videos released by Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad depicting emaciated Israeli hostages are deeply disturbing. The ill treatment and abuse of hostages constitute a blatant violation of international law. Hostages must be treated with dignity and allowed to receive visits and assistance from International Committee of the Red Cross. Mr. President, unthinkably, Gaza's population is now facing yet another deadly escalation. On 8 August, the Israeli government announced its decision to take over Gaza City. The resulting military operation is ongoing and, as we speak, for the population already struggling to survive, the Palestinians in Gaza are now seeing their worst fear becoming reality in front of their eyes. Already, 86% of the Gaza Strip lies within Israeli military zones. Expanded military operations in Gaza City will have catastrophic consequences, including displacement of hundreds of thousands. I am deeply alarmed by the findings of the latest IPC analysis, confirming that famine is engulfing the Gaza governorate. Ending famine is a race against time. It will require a dramatic increase in the quantity and quality of food entering Gaza. It will also require restoring the basic systems, such as water and sanitation, health services, food production, all what is needed to sustain human life. My colleague, Assistant Secretary General Msuya, will cover the IPC findings in more detail in her briefing. Mr. President, recent steps by Israel, including the 27 July announcement of a daily pause in operations in specific areas in Western Gaza, and its approval on the 5th August of a mechanism for the controlled entry of commercial goods, have increased the supply of essential items to Gaza. Israeli authorities have also approved the entry of more diverse array of supplies, including animal feed materials starting this week. But let's be clear, these steps are nowhere near sufficient to address the vast scale of the needs. The lack of law and order also presents a significant obstacle to humanitarian operations. The unbearable conditions in Gaza have led to looting by desperate civilians, while looting by organized groups also continues to undermine relief efforts. It is imperative to restore the required condition for functional, community-based distribution systems to reach the most vulnerable. Israel's imposition of the new